Today's episode was going to have a Thanksgiving theme. That's because Anita, who asked us not to use her last name and whose story this is, left me with images of two moments I can't shake. The first one happened just after her son, Pharaoh, got out of the hospital. This was a few days before Thanksgiving in 2023. The hospital was psychiatric because Pharaoh lives with schizophrenia. But he was let out with no plan, no place to live, with nothing but a prescription he was never going to fill. Anita had no idea where he was because he was back on the streets, homeless. This kind of thing had happened before. A lot. Anita was so mad that she filled out a long application for a brand new program she helped create called the CARE Act. It was a law in California meant to help her son get off the streets permanently. Now here's the image. She then bundled up all the paperwork, got in her car, picked up her brother and sister for moral support, and drove to the courthouse to turn the petition in for her son, because she wanted to stand in front of the clerk and personally see the application get stamped. The second moment happened the next Thanksgiving. Anita pulled 4 chairs around her dinner table, one for everyone in the family, including Pharaoh. She set 4 places, put down 4 plates, and 4 glasses. When the time came to eat, Pharaoh's chair was empty. She had set his place knowing he wasn't going to show. Because even though he had been in the CARE Act program for almost a year, he was back on the streets, homeless, and getting no treatment. The system had failed her son. Again. So today's story isn't about Thanksgiving or laws like the CARE Act. It's about systems. And today's producer is someone with a genius for seeing through them. Her name is Ruth Shim, and she's a psychiatrist at the University of California, Davis. She has a long history of gazing into things with quiet fearlessness until they reveal what they are. When she pulls back the curtain on this system, what she sees is a monster. And if we don't name it, flush it out, and defang it, we're not going to get better. None of us. Ever. Coming up on Brain Stories. A show about one of the most bewildering mysteries of the human experience, mental illness, told by people who live with it and those who support them. This episode includes substance use, physical abuse, violence, and strong language, so listen with care. It also includes sorrow, joy, power, and many moving incidents. Here is Ruth.
Anita was born in San Francisco. She grew up in a close-knit Black family with one of those superhero single mothers. Her mom worked full-time as a nurse while instilling strong religious values in Anita, her brother, and her sister. Anita went off to college, but in her first year, her mother died suddenly from a stroke. So Anita left school for an entry-level job at a bank to support herself. Then she met Melvin.
And that's really where the story begins.
Melvin had spent 6 years in the Navy and then began working at Veterans Affairs. Anita saw him as stable, financially independent, and most importantly, a fundamentally good man. They dated for about a year and then married. But almost immediately, Anita became concerned.
Probably right after the wedding, it really goes back that far. I think I started to see some signs of wait a minute, what's going on?
Signs like withdrawing from friends and family, sudden outbursts of anger, and odd ideas that didn't seem grounded in reality.
But I thought, well, we could make this work. And then he seemed to come out of it and, we would go on. Again, we were just living our little, newly married life.
Within a year, they had a baby boy. They named him Pharaoh. Melvin was a proud new dad.
He was initially, excited, had a good father, and everything. But then things started to change. I started to see he even left his job just on a whim. He would have conversations that were just not tied to reality. And just for no reason, his anger was really bad. And anything could trigger it, and that's what I tried to avoid. So I tried to keep me and the baby out of harm's way.
At the time, Anita had no idea that Melvin was experiencing a serious mental health issue. She was simply afraid. Whenever possible, she tried to steer clear of him. But the relationship quickly turned physically abusive.
And that's when I knew that, I had to leave.
She started looking for an opportunity to escape. She leaned on her faith.
I used to pray every single day. I said, God, please get me out of this.
Anita would get up every day, muster as much of a smile as she could, and go to work. But one morning, she told Melvin that she just couldn't do it.
I just said to him, I said, I'm not feeling well. I'm not going to go to work today. And then he left the bedroom, and I remember he came back and he said to me, you can go. And actually, he was crying. And I think he knew.
Some part of Melvin understood that he had to set Anita and Pharaoh free.
And I realized he probably was battling because he was a good person, that even within himself, look what I'm doing to this woman and my child.
Melvin agreed to a divorce. He even helped Anita and Pharaoh move into their own place. For a while, he paid Pharaoh's preschool fees. Then one day, he told Anita he was moving out of state. He didn't say where. For a few months, she continued getting money orders from him for Pharaoh's schooling. But then, they stopped. And Anita never heard from Melvin again. Pharaoh was 3 years old. For the next few years, Anita worked at the bank and raised Pharaoh as a single mom. Then she reconnected with a former neighbor, Brett. They began dating. One of the big things that drew Anita to Brett was how much Pharaoh lit up when he came around.
Just how he would smile, just how he would, because sometimes he'd be a little distant from any guy that I might have been talking to, but with Brett, it was different, the way Brett engaged him.
In time, she and Brett decided to get married. Pharaoh was the one who walked Anita down the aisle. He thrived in his new family, which had grown to include his little brother, Brett Jr. When Pharaoh was a junior in high school, the family moved to San Diego for Brett's work. Pharaoh was a good student. He was well-liked, he played sports, and worked part-time. But when it came time to apply to colleges, something seemed off. Pharaoh, always ambitious and successful, became unmotivated.
He just seemed, I don't think I want to go to college or whatever anymore. And I said, well, okay, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines. I said, until you figure out what you want to do with your life.
Pharaoh chose the Army. He shipped off to boot camp, where he excelled. When the day to graduate from basic training arrived, Anita was there, proudly supporting her son.
I saw a changed young man. He was just so, you could tell maturity,
Pharaoh was interested in pursuing a career in healthcare. So he applied for a position as a medical specialist and became one of just 2 in his class chosen to train at the prestigious Walter Reed Army Medical Center in Washington, D.C. Anita was bursting with pride.
We went on a trip to D.C. and we saw him, went to the hospital, saw him all dressed in his whites, and everybody said to us, oh, he's such a great guy. He's going to do great. And I was hearing that. I was like, wow, he's on his pathway.
For a couple of years, Pharaoh got top medical training at Walter Reed. He signed up for college classes. He was rising in the ranks of the military. Things were going great. Then Pharaoh came home on break. Anita noticed that he wasn't as meticulous about his appearance as he usually was. And he was drinking so heavily that she urged him to see his sergeant when he returned to get help. At the end of his leave, she dropped him at the airport for his flight back to D.C. But she had a really bad feeling.
I was worried. Because he had been home before and everything was great and he was fine. We didn't see that behavior. And when I remember that when I went to, fix his room back and I opened the closet door and there were liquor bottles just piled up in the closet. And I was like, what in the world? No rhyme or reason to it. Was wine, vodka, tequila. It was like somebody trying to deaden something. And I was like, okay, he's in trouble.
3 days went by.
And I remember waiting to hear from him. Yep, I'm back and all, whatever. But I got a call from his sergeant that said, do you know where your son is?
Pharaoh hadn't returned to D.C. Anita learned that instead, he had connected with some men who had been kicked out of the Army. They began drinking and ended up in Pennsylvania in the middle of a snowstorm. The men had Pharaoh pay for a hotel room because he had some money. But at some point, they threw him out, probably because of Pharaoh's increasingly erratic behavior. Finding himself alone in the freezing cold, Pharaoh reached out to his mom. Anita is a born problem solver, so she sprang into action, booking him a place for the night, wiring him money to buy a train ticket back to D.C., and urging him to report back in. But by now, she was terrified.
I said, oh my gosh, that must be an alcoholic. I have had in my very close family substance use disorder, so I know what addiction looks like. I know how it can disrupt your life. And so I just knew, I said, he's going to ruin his career here.
Pharaoh made it back to Walter Reed. Anita learned that he'd be placed on restriction and provided some form of substance use treatment. She relaxed a little. But the relief was short-lived. A week later, she got a call that he had been drinking again and gotten into a fight with another soldier.
I said, Pharaoh got in a fight? That's something in his entire life to that point. Pharaoh had never been in a fight. He wasn't that kind of guy. He was a man's man, but he wasn't a violent, he didn't like violence. But I guess he hit the person with the bottle. And that was enough where, bam, you're going to the brig.
Brig, the military term for prison. Now, I don't want to get ahead of the story here, but remember this moment. This was Pharaoh's first crisis, when out-of-character behavior was pointing to something being wrong with Pharaoh's mental health. But instead of this crisis triggering treatment, he ended up in jail. Pharaoh was court-martialed for assaulting a soldier. The typical outcome for that was a bad conduct discharge. But Pharaoh's military attorney talked with the psychiatrist who saw Pharaoh and learned of the mental health concerns. So Pharaoh's attorney pushed to get him a medical discharge. There's a big difference. A bad conduct discharge means losing veterans' benefits. With a medical discharge, he would have kept them, including one of critical importance: free medical treatment at the VA hospital. As Pharaoh's team built their case, they realized that Anita's testimony would help. So they flew her to Washington, D.C. On the day of the hearing, she took her seat. At that point, the top officer of Pharaoh's unit at Walter Reed spotted her.
And I thought he was going to come over and, chew me out or something he came over. He says, I want to tell you that when we get a fresh batch of new, recruits in, I can usually tell who's going to be a problem. And I was waiting for it. And he says, your son was not one of them. And he says, we are very shocked that we're here.
But the biggest shock that day would be Anita's. That moment occurred when Pharaoh's attorney called the Army psychiatrist to the stand. Anita has a transcript of the hearing.
So it starts off with, Dr. Caruso, do you know my client? Yes, I do. When did you first meet my client? I believe it was June 4th.
The attorney soon asked for the doctor's assessment of Pharaoh's mental health.
Why did you admit him? In my opinion, at that time, he was suffering from schizophrenic form disorder, which is a condition that is manifested by in PhD degree at the time. I was in some sort of shock. I don't think I heard what he was saying next because we'd all heard, oh, that person's a schizophrenic. And it's normally in horror movies, people on these psych wards where people are so, with the word I don't ever use anymore, crazy people, right? So all those things were flying through my brain at the time. But my self-stigma was saying, well, it was the drugs and alcohol. He couldn't possibly have this schizo something.
I need to pause here for a little Psychiatry 101. Schizophreniform disorder, the diagnosis the military psychiatrist gave Pharaoh, basically means that Pharaoh had been experiencing psychotic symptoms for 1 to 6 months. If that period was longer than 6 months, the diagnosis would have been schizophrenia. It matters because the first year when a person starts experiencing psychotic symptoms is the most critical period in the course of the illness. That's the time when treatment is often most beneficial. Although Pharaoh was briefly on medication during his time in the brig, he was never given a comprehensive approach known as coordinated specialty care. It was developed for people in the early stages of psychosis, and it's a lot more effective because it's a combination of treatments. These treatments typically include education about psychosis, family therapy, individual therapy, medication management, support for completing school and getting a job, case management, and peer support. By more effective, I mean healthier outcomes that include less time in psychiatric hospitals and jails, less expense, and less suffering. Unfortunately, in 1999, when Pharaoh was first experiencing psychosis, coordinated specialty care programs did not yet exist. So obviously, the military couldn't provide it. But the military also couldn't provide the most basic and critical first step, recognition of Pharaoh's illness. Despite expert testimony and abundant evidence that Pharaoh had developed a mental illness, he still received a bad conduct discharge. He was sentenced to a few more months in the brig.
No one understood mental illness. They were like, okay, this is a problem guy, let's get him out of here. People didn't understand.
So in this first year, when Pharaoh was showing all the signs of schizophrenia, when treatment would have had the greatest effect, the military pulled out. The burden of understanding what was going on with Pharaoh and paying for treatment fell entirely to Anita and her family. Months later, Pharaoh was released from the brig, processed out of the army, and given a plane ticket for a flight home. Of course, he missed that flight because he was so sick. In a final send-off, the military put him on a bus for the 3-day trip back to San Diego. Anita met him at the bus station, knowing from phone conversations they had during the trip that his mental health wasn't good.
He was so disorganized that literally next to the station was this inexpensive hotel, motel, whatever. I said, I think I'm going to put you here for a couple of days, and then we can talk through what's next.
For Anita, it started a long odyssey of supporting her son. The first step, coming to terms with what he had and overcoming her own feelings about it, would take some time. For the next couple of years, Pharaoh shuttled between home, hotel rooms, shelters, and living on the streets, never settling and never stable.
Where else was I going to put him? What else was I going to do? I didn't even know about any services or anything.
For Pharaoh, this time would mark the beginning of a never-ending cycle of illness and wellness, chaos and stability. He had a prescription for the antipsychotic drug he had been given in the military, but mostly he didn't take it. He would drink heavily at times. Anita locked away all the alcohol in the house. She and her husband were at work during the day, but she eventually learned from Pharaoh's younger brother that maybe it was even worse for Pharaoh when he didn't drink.
He would be in his room yelling at the top of his lungs. Well, it was the voices, and he was trying to yell them away.
But Anita didn't know that yet. She still hoped Pharaoh's problem was just alcohol and maybe drugs. Their home was filled with tension and conflict.
The household was just a mess. Nobody's happy. Everybody, I just remember those being some very sad and tough times.
3 years after Pharaoh returned home, Anita learned about an organization called NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness. After talking to a man who worked there, who shared that he had walked in her shoes, she and Brett enrolled in the family-to-family course. It would prove a massive turning point in her understanding. First, she began to accept that Pharaoh's issue wasn't just drug or alcohol use. He was also living with schizophrenia. Next, she recognized that many of the behaviors of her first husband, Melvin, had been similar. She realized now that he had also had a mental illness. And she began to see how much shame and discrimination there was around mental illness, even in herself, and how if she was really going to help Pharaoh, the first thing she had to do was confront the stigma. There was a final, maybe surprising benefit. The understanding of Pharaoh's illness improved everything at home, especially between Anita and her husband, Brett.
That's why I always say it did save our marriage. We probably wouldn't have survived. Marriage would not have survived.
But even before Anita and Brett had attended the first session, Pharaoh's behavior had become so erratic that he was living on the streets.
He was missing at this point. We didn't know where he was, and we just are waiting for that call to come to tell us where he is or if he needs help or whatever.
On the streets, Pharaoh turned from alcohol to drugs. And not just any drug, crack cocaine, a drug that devastated Black communities in the United States during a decades-long epidemic.
I remember when it started in the 70s in my working middle-class African-American neighborhood in San Francisco. I watched it flood our neighborhood and destroy entire families.
The crack epidemic in the United States peaked in the 1980s and continued through the 1990s. I want to spend a minute on this because Pharaoh wasn't just battling a mental illness and drug use. He inadvertently got caught up in a system in which Black people were being chewed up and spit out by racist policies. Here's the background. The epidemic disproportionately impacted Black communities due to inequitable laws like the 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act. That act mandated that if a person was arrested for possessing 1 gram of crack cocaine, they would get the very same jail sentence as someone arrested with 100 grams of powder cocaine. Crack cocaine and powder cocaine are the exact same chemical compounds, but are just different formulations of the drug. So a sentencing distinction between these two drugs does not make legal or scientific sense. However, there is one massive difference between crack cocaine and powder cocaine. Poor Black people were more likely to be associated, mostly by the media, with crack cocaine, and rich white people were more likely to be associated with powder cocaine. Think Samuel L. Jackson's character in Jungle Fever versus Leonardo DiCaprio's character in The Wolf of Wall Street. Anita knows this.
Because back then, the quote crack people were, the people addicted to crack cocaine were African American. The people who were considered the drug dealers who ran the crack houses, African American, the face of crack was the African American population.
In fact, according to the Equal Justice Initiative, from 1991 to 2001, 9 times as many Black people as white people went to federal prison for crack offenses. And Black people's sentences for crack were double that for white crack offenders, 148 months compared to 84 months.
Criminalized. Everybody was criminalized back then.
Make no mistake, the differential treatment between crack and powder cocaine is because of structural racism, in which systems, policies, and institutions are designed in a way that provides advantages to white people and creates disadvantages for people of color. Structural racism is why crack cocaine is dealt with by locking people away in jail instead of having them see a doctor for substance use treatment. Meanwhile, opioids like oxycodone and fentanyl are managed by doctors in clinics, not jails, using something called medication-assisted treatment. Anita is quite clear on these distinctions.
And I always say that's a racial thing because it was the white kids that got addicted to the fentanyl. Because I would hear stories from non-Black people, and I said, really? Oh, they took them to the hospital and they did all that? Very different stories would happen with my son and what would happen with their sons or daughters.
So in that chaotic period in the early 2000s, Pharaoh started getting arrested for being in possession of crack cocaine, being under the influence, or breaking into a building for a place to sleep. The vast majority were minor offenses.
He was going to jail, but then they started, because you can only go to jail so many times. So 2004 was the first time he went and entered the California Department of Corrections.
Pharaoh's first stint in state prison was followed by many more.
2005, 2006, 2008, 2009. In these, I'm telling you, they were drug-related.
This was Pharaoh's never-ending cycle. He would do well while he was taking medication. He'd typically receive housing and a treatment program, and he'd be himself again, engaged, capable, and smiling. But then the downturn would begin again.
And it starts the same exact way. Stop the meds. He doesn't meet criteria for 5150 hospitalization.
5150 refers to the part of California's legal code that allows someone with a mental illness to be forcibly admitted to a psychiatric hospital for treatment, not punishment. But to meet criteria for a 5150, You either have to be a danger to yourself or others, or be so sick that you can't effectively care for your basic needs. A mental health provider often makes this decision, but police have the discretion to take someone with a mental illness to be evaluated at a medical facility or to jail. For Pharaoh, the police would consistently choose jail.
He starts self-medicating. He ends up arrested for something like vandalism, you know. And I always chuckle. This is a cynical chuckle when I see resisting arrest. Of course he is. He's psychotic.
The cycle always came back to incarceration.
How many jail sentences and arrests? 50. 60. I don't even know anymore.
And in jail, the cycle would start again. Because there, Pharaoh could be forced by a court hearing to take medication, and once again, begin his recovery from psychosis. But the cost was huge. Prison is brutal for anyone. For someone with a mental illness, exponentially so. They are an especially vulnerable community, in a place where vulnerability is often cruelly and violently exploited. Anita will never forget one incident in 2007. By that time, she was in a dramatically different place. She had decided to resign from the bank, where she had risen to vice president, to start working at NAMI. It was a significant cut in pay, but she felt it was a calling to help her son and all the people like him and their families. Even though she had no background in behavioral health, she was a born advocate. And she would need all those skills for what was about to happen to Pharaoh. At the time, he was serving a sentence at the only state prison in San Diego County. But when Anita visited him, she was shocked.
He just looked horrible. I said, wait a minute, he looks worse than when he was on the streets. Fingernails, hair matted, clothes looked like they had he was skinny and emaciated, you know. And I was like, okay, he's dying within these prison walls.
When she called the prison to explain Pharaoh's mental illness and asked for care, they said that it was a choice for Pharaoh not to shower, change his clothes, or eat. They said there was nothing they could do. So Anita called the prison official who investigates complaints and asked them to look into it. A few days later, when Anita called the prison for an update on Pharaoh, she got a terrible surprise.
They said, he's no longer here. He's been transferred. I said, transferred where? To Pelican Bay.
Pelican Bay is a prison in Northern California that is classified as Supermax, a top security prison built to be inescapable. It's notorious for holding the most violent and dangerous populations.
It's the worst prison for the worst of the worst of the worst criminals. You know, the murderers, the rapists, the mass murder, that's who goes there. And they had sent my mentally ill son there, who had done nothing more than become addicted to the crack cocaine on the streets.
There was another thing about it that seemed additionally cruel. Pelican Bay was in Crescent City, at the very northern edge of the state, the most distant prison in California from where Anita and Brett lived. Instead of a 23-minute drive from their house, Pharaoh was now 860 miles away. A trip that required a hotel, meals, airfare, 2 days off from work, and over $1,000 in cost, all for a 30-minute visit.
I was so mad.
But Anita, as she often did, channeled her anger into action.
I was getting ready to take that flight to Crescent City. You know, I said, oh, who they think they're effing with, because I will let them know he's got parents, he's got family, and you're not going to bury him in the bowels of this prison with this condition.
Before Anita could book the flight, she would get an account of an incident at Pelican Bay. It would come from a legal document that arrived unceremoniously in her mailbox. It was heartbreaking.
And they wrote about, I can't even say, they described that he was balled up in the corner of his cell, wouldn't eat, and had feces all over himself. He literally was like a caged animal, locked in his psychosis.
Not surprisingly, Pharaoh didn't accept medication voluntarily. So the prison guards performed what they call a cell extraction.
They put on riot gear, and then they go in to the cell and literally rip him out. So it sounds as horrible. You think of a tooth extraction, that doesn't feel good. It's painful, and that's why they call it that. Well, they were doing this to a human being that was mentally ill.
Anita didn't learn about the extraction until weeks after it had taken place. And soon after reading the account, she received a welcome surprise, a phone call from her son.
It literally was a day later. The phone rings. He was clear-headed and whatever. Hi, Mom. This is Pharaoh. How's everybody doing? I know that he's back. See, he's on medication again.
And even better, a couple of weeks later, Pharaoh was suddenly released, despite months remaining on his sentence. There was no explanation why. Almost as quickly as Pelican Bay began, it was over. About a year later, Anita obtained a copy of his prison records and learned he had been given a compassionate release. To this day, she doesn't know exactly how or why it happened, but she credits her faith and her relentless advocacy in helping to bring Pharaoh home. Finding an effective medication for someone with schizophrenia can be a difficult and complicated ordeal. But for Pharaoh, medication always helped.
When he bounces back, he has the most beautiful smile and dimples. And when he is back, that smile, he's never angry. He never walks around in this has happened to me while I was out there, this or that. Oh, he remembers it, but he shoves it somewhere. And he just becomes joyful, the joyful person that he is.
There were a lot of periods in Pharaoh's life when he accepted medication and flourished. One was in his early 30s, not long after Pelican Bay. He was living at home. He graduated from a recovery program, then got trained in peer counseling. Soon, he was hired for a relatively new position as a peer support specialist on a hotline. While he was working, he volunteered to do a short video about his recovery entitled Standing Soldier.
Oh, I know it by heart. It starts off with a picture of him in his Army uniform.
In 1997, I passed basic training in AIT school with flying colors.
That's Pharaoh. He described his love of sports, then the onset of mental illness, the stigma, and the cost.
I spent 11 years in and out of jails, prisons, institutions, and homeless. With God and family support, I finally sought help and came to a place of recovery. It took
This shows him at his recovery, just how his life was at that time, that his occupation was a peer helpline specialist.
Today, I am 2 years free from active addiction. I have peace from my symptoms, and I am filled with hope.
Joyful, happy.
And I live with my loving family. My life has truly been restored.
This was supposed to be the end of the story. This was supposed to be the success story after this, and we thought it was as a family.
Within 1 year of the video being filmed, Pharaoh stopped taking his medication, and the cycle started again. The cycle has continued on and off for 15 years, with no ending in sight. Anita has long felt that the key to Pharaoh's health was medication.
If that medication did not bring him back to that place, I wouldn't even bother with it. I wouldn't even be fighting this fight because it would be, useless. But it isn't useless. The medication works for him, restoring him to a place of wellness and independence.
Anita is angry. Some of that anger is directed at Pharaoh, who is, after all, the one who stops taking the medication.
I was pissed at him. I am, because I know that while he has gone through all of the peer trainings and peer this and that and NA groups and whatever, on and off over the years, I want to say, you should know better. You keep making the same poor decisions, but I know he has a broken brain. So then I come back around to that. So my emotions are kind of all over the place because I said I shouldn't be angry at him. It's the system. When I asked for involuntary care and treatment, it's refused because he's not a danger to self or others.
She feels that it shouldn't have to require a crisis. If necessary, a partial loss of freedom, forcing Pharaoh to take medication, is far better than a system that allows him to go untreated and always results in a total loss of freedom, incarceration. I understand Anita's perspective, but I also believe there may be something more insidious at work. Anita and I are similar in a lot of ways. We are both Black women who live in a country that has never really acknowledged or accepted the full humanity of Black people. We both claim the identity of advocates, fighting to fix a broken mental health system. We both have experienced the heartbreak of caring for Black people with psychosis who struggle to recover from their mental illnesses, although we approach this heartbreak from two very different perspectives, Anita as a mother and me as a psychiatrist. While I have spent my career studying the debilitating effects of structural racism on mental health, Anita and Pharaoh have lived it.
Why is the Los Angeles County Jail the largest mental health facility in the country? Because of that very thing. We're not the only parents, whose children never should have touched the criminal justice system. I'm not just saying that as an African American, but my son gets taken to jail where someone else might get taken to the hospital. It goes back to, if you have a population of people that have been through what we've gone through in America, of course we've been damaged in some way permanently.
That damage, from enslavement to Jim Crow to the enduring and modern-day effects of structural racism, has been documented by experts. Its forms are as diverse as they are destructive. In Antonia Hilton's book, Madness, she chronicles how, in 1911, Black patients were forced to build their own asylum, which ultimately served to keep thousands of unwanted Black people with mental illness from mixing with respectable society. Jonathan Metzl's book, The Protest Psychosis, recounts how Black men in the 1960s who were fighting for their civil rights were characterized as hostile, paranoid, and delusional. They were often misdiagnosed with schizophrenia and locked away in psychiatric hospitals as a tool to help maintain the status quo, in which white people have power and control, and Black people remain at the bottom of the racial caste. And today, emerging research, like work by psychologist Deidre Anglin, is highlighting how societal stress, like racism and discrimination, can increase someone's likelihood of developing psychosis, leading to higher rates of schizophrenia in immigrants and people of color, including Black people. There is a clear pattern, a long arc of how structural racism and mental illness are intertwined. Anita is not a psychiatrist or a historian, but she understands the connection all too well.
I believe that our mental illness definitely stems from the systemic racism that is America, that is woven throughout America.
Black people today face barriers to home ownership, financial stability, education, health, employment, wealth, clean drinking water, breathable air, and even their very liberation and freedom. This is not because Black people are inherently inferior, and it is not because of individuals or groups who hold racist views, like white nationalists. Instead, it has been woven into the fabric of American life from our country's founding. And, like the air we breathe, it is everywhere, even if we can't readily see it. Remember the video Pharaoh made about his recovery? In it, he made a surprising statement that it wasn't the schizophrenia that was so painful. It was the stigma.
It made me feel imprisoned, like my freedom of self-expression had been taken away.
Even though Pharaoh has experienced literal imprisonment many times in his life, in the video, he speaks about a figurative imprisonment brought about by society's response to his illness. Pharaoh's medical condition was criminalized from the start, all those years ago when he landed in the brig. From its inception, our mental health care system was designed to make jails and prisons a central part of the treatment process, especially for people of color.
Jail doesn't help anybody heal. Never, ever. I will never accept, I don't care how many clinicians and doctors are in a jail or a prison, that is not a place of healing. that is a place for punishment.
There's an old movie called Sliding Doors, in which Gwyneth Paltrow's character lives out two very different lives depending on whether or not she catches a train. Pharaoh's sliding doors moment came during his first mental health crisis, all those years ago in the military. In an alternate universe, not built on criminalizing Black people with mental illness, the response was not to throw him in the brig. It was to provide him with compassionate and timely treatment. And in that universe, Pharaoh recovered. He flourished in a long career in healthcare. He bought a home, got married, had children, and he never went to jail once. But in this universe, a universe built on structural racism, the only choice is between neglect or oppression. It is a vicious cycle, and it's exhausting.
I am tired. I think that I am tired of talking about it. I'm tired of fighting. I am just sick and tired.
I'm tired too. I often say that the system works the way it was designed to work. That means our dysfunctional healthcare system, where mental illness is criminalized and people can't access basic care, is functioning exactly as it was meant to. It was built to be a broken, racist system that punishes and oppresses some instead of providing care and compassion to everyone. Even more tragically, this broken system harms all of us, not just the Black and brown people who have experienced its most brutal cruelty firsthand. Unfortunately, the solutions are not easy. They require a complete transformation of the way we think about who in our society is worthy of respect, care, and basic human decency, and the reforming of our laws and policies that have stolen the lives of people of color with mental illnesses. It will require, as Martin Luther King Jr. said, a qualitative change in our souls as well as a quantitative change in our lives. That is no small feat to accomplish. It feels insurmountable. But we must all keep fighting to change the system. So I will continue to fight. And Anita will never stop fighting for Pharaoh.
Thanks for listening. If you have a question, comment, or you just want to give us your reaction to the story, we'd really like to hear from you. So call us and leave a message. Our number is 424-240-9302. If you have a story to share, you can leave that too. But even better, record an audio message on your phone if you can, and email it to brainstoriesproductions@gmail.com. If you like this episode, share it with your friends, your family, or perfect strangers. Your superpower is a recommendation. Use it. If you'd like to learn more about the issues in the show, Anita offers a consulting service from a family perspective for those dealing with serious mental illness. You can find it at fishermhconsulting.com. And check out BEAM, the Black Emotional and Mental Health Collective, at beam.community. You can find links for these, the full video that Pharaoh made, and others at our webpage, brainstoriesproductions.com. Thanks to the team that made this story possible. Our associate producer and editor was Kate Ruscosa. The episode producer was Dr. Ruth Shim. Karen Given was our incredible story editor, and our audio mixer was Rob Beyer. The show is executive produced by Frank Kosa and Janet Yang. As always, thanks to our advisors and all our supporters. Coming up on the next episode of Brain Stories, Adrian was 13 when he learned schizophrenia was hereditary. All he knew at that age was that his dad had it, and though he couldn't know when, he was sure he was going to get it too. It took him 2 decades to learn what you truly inherit when your parent lives with a serious mental illness. Don't miss this episode. This show is a copyright of Brain Stories Productions and the Samo Bay Corporation. The use of this episode or any of its content in any form or way for artificial intelligence, its development or training, is copyright infringement and expressly prohibited without prior written agreement. Bye till next time.